Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. You read a headline that matches something you already believe, and you share it almost immediately, barely reading past the first paragraph. Then someone sends you a study that directly contradicts that belief, and you spend 10 minutes finding reasons why the study is flawed, why the sample size was too small, why the researchers had an agenda. You do not do this on purpose. You are not even fully aware it is happening, but by the end of that conversation, your original belief feels more solid than when it started, even though you just encountered serious evidence against it. That is confirmation bias, the tendency of the brain to seek out, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm existing beliefs, while systematically dismissing or minimizing information that challenges them. The psychologist Peter Wason first demonstrated this experimentally in 1960, and the results have been replicated so many times since that it is now considered one of the most consistently documented patterns in human cognition. What makes confirmation bias particularly difficult to escape is that it does not feel like bias from the inside, it feels like sound reasoning. The bias and the critical thinking look almost identical when you are the one doing them. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect. You have probably met someone who had just started learning something, maybe a few weeks into picking up guitar or reading basic economics, and they spoke about it with total confidence, correcting people who had spent years in the field. And then you have probably noticed what happens when someone actually masters a subject. They become more careful with their language, more aware of exceptions and edge cases, more likely to say they are not entirely sure. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the cognitive pattern where people with limited knowledge or skill in a specific area tend to overestimate their own competence, while people with genuine expertise tend to underestimate themselves relative to others around them. Psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger identified and named this in a 1999 study at Cornell University, and the core finding has held up across repeated research in different domains. To accurately evaluate your own performance in any skill, you need enough of that skill to recognize what competent performance actually looks like. Beginners lack this internal benchmark, so they have no reliable way to measure the gap between where they currently are and where real competence begins. The Dunning-Kruger effect is worth understanding not only because it explains overconfident people, but also because it is a reminder that the loudest voice in a room is not always the most informed one. The sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy. You are 30 minutes into a movie that is clearly not working for you. You do not want to watch the rest of it, but you paid for it, so you sit through the remaining 90 minutes feeling increasingly frustrated, telling yourself you might as well finish since you already spent the money. The money is gone either way, but you stay anyway. That is the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing time, money, or energy into something based on what has already been spent, rather than on what actually makes sense going forward. The term comes from economics, where a sunk cost is defined as any past expenditure that cannot be recovered regardless of future decisions. The bias enters when people allow those unrecoverable costs to drive future choices, even when those choices should logically be based only on expected future value. The pain of losing something feels roughly twice as powerful psychologically as the pleasure of gaining an equivalent thing, which makes walking away from a failed investment feel like actively confirming the loss rather than simply acknowledging it. The practical consequence is that people stay in bad relationships, struggling businesses, and careers they stopped caring about years ago, not because staying makes rational sense, but because leaving means confronting the fact that what was already spent cannot be recovered. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias. A store lists a jacket at $400, then marks it down to $250. You have never owned a jacket that cost more than $120, but you buy it because the discount makes it feel like a deal. That initial $400 number restructured how you evaluated everything that followed, even though it was an arbitrary starting point set by the retailer. Anchoring bias is the tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information encountered when making a decision, allowing that initial number or fact to disproportionately shape all subsequent judgments. Tversky and Kahneman first described anchoring in 1974 as part of their foundational research on cognitive heuristics. In one of their most striking experiments, participants watched a wheel land on a random number, then were asked to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. The higher the number the wheel landed on, the higher participants estimated, even though everyone in the room understood the wheel spin was completely arbitrary. The brain reaches for the first available reference point when navigating uncertainty, and that reference point distorts every comparison that follows. Salary negotiations, real estate pricing, and retail marketing are all built around this reliability. The availability heuristic. The availability heuristic. After watching a news segment about a plane crash, many people feel genuinely nervous about flying for a few days, even though statistically they face significantly greater risk driving to the airport. The plane crash is vivid. It is easy to picture in detail. The mental image loads quickly, and that ease of recall makes the danger feel much larger than the actual numbers support. The availability heuristic is the mental shortcut, where the brain estimates the likelihood of an event based on how quickly and easily examples of it come to mind. Tversky and Kahneman named and described this heuristic in 1973. The problem is that ease of recall is also shaped by how vivid, recent, or emotionally charged something is, not only by how common it is. A single dramatic news story can make a rare event feel widespread, while risks that are slow, invisible, or statistically distributed, like poor nutrition or physical inactivity, remain abstract and easy to push aside. This is why public perception of crime often rises during heavy news coverage, even when crime rates are falling, and why people who live near someone who won a lottery consistently overestimate their own odds of winning. The spotlight effect. The spotlight effect. You show up to a meeting with a coffee stain on your shirt and spend the entire hour convinced that everyone in the room has noticed it and is privately thinking about it. You replay the moment that evening before you fall asleep. Meanwhile, not one person in that meeting gave it a second thought after the first second. The spotlight effect is the tendency to overestimate how much other people notice and pay attention to things about you, including your appearance, your mistakes, your nervous habits, and your behavior in public situations. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky named and studied this at Cornell University in the late 1990s. In one experiment, they had participants wear a t-shirt featuring an embarrassing image on it, then estimate how many people in a room had noticed the shirt. Participants consistently overestimated by nearly double the actual number observed. Other people are primarily occupied with their own concerns, their own appearance, and their own internal monologue. What the spotlight effect offers, when you understand it, is a genuine reduction in the weight of ordinary social anxiety, because most of the audience you are performing for exists entirely in your own head. Negativity bias. Negativity bias. You receive 12 compliments on a piece of work and one critical comment, and you spend the rest of the day focused on the critical comment. The compliments fade relatively quickly. The criticism stays sharp and detailed. This is not a character flaw or a sign of low confidence. It is a structural feature of how human cognition operates, and it has a precise name. Negativity bias is the well-documented tendency for negative experiences, emotions, and information to have a greater psychological impact than positive ones of equivalent intensity. The evolutionary reasoning behind it is fairly clear. For most of human history, failing to notice a threat had far worse survival consequences than failing to notice an opportunity. So nervous systems that paid closer attention to danger were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Negative events are processed more thoroughly, remembered more vividly, and influence behavior more powerfully than positive ones. A single bad experience with a product or person can override dozens of good ones, and a reputation can be built slowly over years and damaged in a matter of hours. Knowing this does not eliminate the bias, but it gives you a reason to apply a deliberate correction when evaluating situations, feedback, and people fairly. The curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge. You know how something works so well that the knowledge has become automatic for you, something you no longer consciously retrieve but simply use. So when you try to explain it to someone who is learning it for the first time, you skip over the foundational steps because they feel self-evident, and the person looks confused, and you genuinely cannot figure out why, because from where you are standing, it just is not that complicated. That gap is called the curse of knowledge, the cognitive bias where deeply understanding something makes it genuinely difficult to reconstruct what it felt like not to know it. The term was introduced by economists Colin Camerer, George Lowenstein, and Martin Weber in a 1989 paper on information asymmetry. Once a piece of information becomes deeply integrated into your thinking, it functions more like a background assumption than a distinct retrievable fact. You no longer consciously recall it, you just operate from it, which makes it invisible to you as a concept that once needed to be learned. This is why experienced practitioners sometimes have more trouble teaching beginners than people who learned the skill more recently do. It is also why product designers who deeply understand their own software frequently overlook the confusion points that trip up new users, not because they are careless, but because they have genuinely forgotten what it was like to encounter that interface without already knowing how it works. Optimism bias. Optimism bias. Ask 100 people whether they consider themselves above average drivers, and somewhere between 80 and 90% will say yes. Ask the same group to estimate their personal likelihood of getting divorced, developing a serious illness, or being involved in a significant accident, and most will rate themselves as less at risk than average, even after being shown accurate statistics about how common those outcomes actually are. This is optimism bias, the tendency to overestimate the probability of positive events in your own future and underestimate the probability of negative ones, regardless of the actual base rates that apply to everyone. Neuroscientist Tali Sharot has studied this extensively and estimates that roughly 80% of the population shows some measurable form of this bias. Research consistently shows that people with genuinely realistic assessments of their prospects tend to be somewhat more prone to depression than optimistic ones, and that optimism bias correlates with persistence, resilience, and the willingness to take necessary risks. The issue arises when it leads people to systematically underinvest in preparation for realistic negative outcomes, like not maintaining an emergency fund because things will probably be fine, or consistently underestimating how long a project will take because this one will surely be different. Optimism bias does not feel like self-deception. It feels like confidence. Those two things are closely related, but they are not the same. Blind spot bias. Blind spot bias. You can probably name 3 or 4 cognitive biases right now that you have noticed in people around you. You have recognized your colleague's confirmation bias at work, a friend's sunk cost thinking in a bad relationship, a family member's optimism bias in financial decisions. What is considerably harder for almost everyone is catching those same patterns operating in yourself, in real time, as they are actually happening. That asymmetry has a name. Blind spot bias is the tendency to recognize cognitive biases in other people more readily than in yourself, typically paired with the conviction that you are less biased than the average person. Emily Pronin at Princeton University, along with colleagues Daniel Lin and Lee Ross, named and studied this in a 2002 paper. They found not only that people rated themselves as less susceptible to a long list of biases compared to others, but that when confronted with direct evidence of their own bias in a specific situation, they tended to explain it away as a product of circumstances rather than as a reflection of their actual thinking patterns.